One student wants to know, do you find modern-day invitational methods and decision-seeking to be a major hindrance to the gospel?
That's another one of those generalized questions that depends so much on what a person means. D.L. Moody, when he was criticized for his methods, turned to his questioner and said, "What methods do you advocate yourself?" And the questioner said, "Well, I don't really do evangelism. I don't have methods." So Moody replied, "I'd prefer to use the methods I do use that you don't like than the methods you do like that you don't have." So you still want to say when people start criticizing methods of one sort or another, I'd rather have people making lots of mistakes in their presentation of the gospel and pushing people to repentance and faith than not doing it. Moreover, it's often not just methods per se. It's the context in which a method occurs. So, for example, if you have a really shoddy presentation of the gospel, it doesn't explain much about what the cross is about, doesn't explain much about the nature of sin, doesn't explain what substitution is about, doesn't explain the wrath of God, doesn't explain any of those things. It just uses a whole lot of religious cliches, but it doesn't explain any of those things. And then you start pressing people to come forward and have eternal life, come forward and have the abundant life, and maybe you're dealing with a congregation that's semi-literate in any case, biblically speaking. Well, within that context, it really is dangerous to push people that way because, to use the language of the prophets, they're in danger of healing my people slightly. That is, they make some sort of profession of faith, of turning in some way to God in some fashion or the other, without understanding what the real issues are. For example, many of the evangelistic approaches that are used today turn on having the abundant life. Would you like to have an abundant life? Step one. Well, what idiot is going to say no? On the other hand, where does the abundant life language come from in the Bible? Do you know? It comes from one verse. In John 10. I have come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. And this in the context of an extended metaphor on sheep. So the sheep are supposed to have a more abundant life. What does that mean? Probably means a whole lot more grass. Do you really want to go to a whole lot of university students and say what they need is more grass? But supposing you're dealing with a bunch of biblical illiterates. When I first started doing university evangelism, then 35 years ago, then if I were dealing with an atheist on a campus, he or she was a Christian atheist. That is to say, the God that they disbelieved in was the Christian God, which is another way of saying the arguments were still on my turf, my categories. I can't even assume that today. The people that I evangelize in university missions today don't know the Bible has two testaments. They've never heard of Abraham. If they've heard of Moses, they confuse him with either Charlton Heston or the more recent cartoon character. They have no idea how the Bible's put together. And all of their religious vocabulary, as slight as it is, faith, God, Jesus, whatever, in every case they mean something different from what I mean. So I come to these people and say, would you like to have abundant life? What do they hear? Oh, yeah, you bet I'd like more sex. Better job. Terrific. Sense of fulfillment. Can you give me that? So they're not hearing at all what the first century hearers heard when Jesus spoke those words in John 10. Do you see? So we're at a time of life when, if we're evangelizing to people outside of the churchified, outside of the category of people who already have a lot of the religious vocabulary, if you're evangelizing in that sort of context, you've got a rebuilding job to do to explain what the categories are, what the Bible storyline is, how the gospel works. That's part of explaining the gospel faithfully. And if you don't do that, and instead then apply immediately to ask people for a decision or to come forward or pray a prayer where they don't understand any of the categories, then you're asking them to leap into an experience without any of the constructs of the content of the gospel that make believing in the gospel coherent. So in that sense, it really is very foolish to push those things. Do you see? But then it's not just whether or not you're pushing somebody to bow to Christ. It's the context in which you're doing it, how well the gospel has genuinely been explained, how well people understand really what the issues really are. So it's one of those questions, again, where it's not method in some cheap little narrow sense that is at issue. The much bigger issue is how faithful a presentation is there of the gospel itself.
Discuss the role of law and gospel in your preaching.
Oh, in 25 words or less. In one sense, the role of law should be pretty substantial. In one sense, in my view, it no longer it shouldn't take top priority. And I need to explain both of those. I said just briefly on the fly tonight that you cannot get agreement on what the good news is until you get agreement on what the problem is. The reverse is also true, incidentally. The solution and the problems stand together. So if you think, for example, that the biggest human problem is economic injustice, then what you need is a new social order. What you need is new economics. That's what you need to fix things. If you think that the biggest human need is loneliness or social misidentity, not finding yourself, then you need some decent psychologists. So you need to have some awareness of what the Bible presents as the fundamental need, the need behind all other needs. And biblically speaking, that is alienation from God. It is, in a word, sin. It is transgression. It is de-godding God. It is idolatry. It is dishonoring God. And until people can see that that is what the problem is, to present Christ as the one who comes along and delivers us from the death that ensues from our sin, then the gospel doesn't make any sense. It's not coherent. You need to present law, let us say, the demand of God, so that people can see what the effect of the law is. We don't live up to God's standards. He says we're supposed to love God with heart and soul and mind and strength, and we don't. He says we're supposed to love our neighbors as ourselves, and we don't. He says we're not supposed to lust, and we do. He says we're not supposed to hate, and we manage that too, and on and on and on and on. And all of these things in the Bible are presented as fundamentally offenses against God himself, against the living God. And he stands over against us not only as our creator and our gracious providential provider, but he also stands over against us as judge. And he has every right to be angry with us. 600 times the Bible portrays God in the Old Testament alone as a wrathful God against us. Not that he's lost his temper, but his wrath is a determined, holy response to human sin. 600 times the Bible insists that God stands over against us in wrath. And so anything that we do, in other words, in preaching the law of God, so as to set up the stage for showing how wonderful the grace of God is surely got to be a good thing. If you talk about the grace of God before people recognize that there's any sort of problem, it's almost inevitably going to turn out to be a bit of cheap grace. Wesley, in one of his letters, I can't remember what number it is, about 137 or something like that, was asked, how do you preach the gospel in any place? That is, he gets on his horse, goes to the next town, starts preaching. What does he do first? He says, I begin, he says, with a general declaration of the love of God and the gospel. And then, he says, I preach law. I preach law so that men may know that they are lost. Then I preach more law. And when, he says, I see a few people come under conviction of sin, knowing they are lost, maybe a few tears, I preach more law. When substantial numbers are clearly under conviction of sin, then he says, this is his expression, I admix a little grace. But only, he says, when the entire congregation is deeply, deeply under the convicting work of the Spirit of God and crying out like those in Acts, what shall we do? Then, he says, I preach grace freely and fully and richly so that they see how glorious is the gospel of God. And then, he says, quickly do I admix law, lest men should presume. Now, that was actually the Puritan view of things. Wesley, deep down, and much of his theology was actually a Puritan. There is something right about all of that. I think there's something wrong with it too. But there's something very deeply right about it. It really reflects the fact that you can't get the gospel right until you see what the problem is. One way or the other, you've got to get that across. But does the name Tim Keller mean anything to you? Yes? No? Yeah. He's a dear friend. He started the Gospel Coalition with me. A Presbyterian minister in New York City. Redeemer Pres now has something like 6,000 or 7,000 people. The average age is 31 or 32. Most of them converts. And they start off in a context like Manhattan, complete biblical illiterates. And over the years, he has learned not to begin with law, but with idolatry. Because today, in a postmodern world, or a world still under the impact of it, in a world with new ideas about tolerance, when you start preaching just law, what people hear you to be saying is, there's some arbitrary being up there that just wants to step off and tell me what to do all the time. None of his business. Says who? But when you begin with idolatry, then you're portraying something of the same thing, but in a relational dimension. That is, the heart of idolatry is you rebel against your maker. That's a form of betrayal. And this generation understands betrayal better than it understands trespass. And, as Keller likes to point out, Paul himself in Romans 5 says that before the law came, that is with Moses and the giving of the law in that big sense, the law covenant, there was still idolatry, and because of it, death. Death reigned from Adam to Moses before the giving of the law. There is still massive idolatry. So there is a sense, you see, in which all of idolatry is transgressing something of God. All of acting against the law is also idolatrous. You can't have one without the other. And if you are preaching holistically, then even if you begin with idolatry, sooner or later you have to get to law. And if you're rightly preaching law, then inevitably you have to show that it's not just arbitrary law, it's law that God has given for our good and his own glory, and not to follow it is a betrayal. So you're into idolatry. Do you see? So it's not that Keller, therefore, wants to duck the importance of the law. He is saying that 100 years ago in this country, or in Great Britain, 200 years ago in most of Europe, to preach the law first, to preach the law in Wesley's sense, was coherent because the law was just about universally understood to be the law of God. And to preach the law, therefore, was a way of showing just how lost and awful and rebellious we were in order to set up the stage for understanding the magnanimity of grace. But in our culture, where you might not understand those categories so well, it might take so much time even to begin to explain them that it is better to begin with idolatry than with law. Do you see? Now, at what point you start introducing the grace of God in the gospel, that still has to be held out there. It has to be the goal toward which we press. I don't care how you get your mixtures in. I wouldn't word it quite the way Wesley did. But nevertheless, somewhere along the line, if you run to grace and the gospel before people have any idea of what the offense is, of what the danger is, of what the death is, of what the wrath of God is, then I suspect that ultimately we end up with a truncated and reduced, diminished gospel.